I was carefully placing the small, worn wooden box on the gift table when my son-in-law Marcus threw back his head and let out a loud, mocking laugh that cut through the wedding reception chatter like a knife. "Seriously, Helen? A jewelry box? From a thrift store?" His voice dripped with condescension as he picked up my gift, turning it over in his manicured hands like it was contaminated. "I mean, I know you're on a teacher's pension, but couldn't you have at least tried to get something from our registry?" The entire bridal party table went silent. My daughter Sarah's face flushed crimson, but she said nothing. Marcus's groomsmen snickered behind their champagne flutes. What Marcus didn't know was that inside that humble wooden box wasn't cheap costume jewelry. It was the deed to the sprawling Victorian mansion he'd been obsessing over for 3 years, the one he drove past every weekend, the one he called his dream house but could never afford. The same house I'd quietly purchased 6 months ago, waiting for the perfect moment to surprise them. But after that display of arrogance and cruelty, I realized Marcus didn't deserve surprises. He deserved lessons. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wedding reception continued around me in a blur of clinking glasses and forced smiles, but I felt like I was watching everything through a thick pane of glass. Marcus had moved on from humiliating me to regaling his friends with stories about his new promotion at the investment firm, his voice carrying that particular brand of smugness that comes from someone who's never been truly challenged. I sat at the family table, my hands folded carefully in my lap, watching my daughter Sarah navigate between appeasing her new husband and avoiding eye contact with me. The shame in her posture told me everything I needed to know about the choice she'd already made. This wasn't the first time Marcus had treated me like an inconvenience. Over the past 2 years of their relationship, I'd watched him systematically dismiss everything about me that didn't serve his narrative of success. When Sarah first brought him home, I was Helen Morrison, the high school English teacher who'd raised her daughter alone after my husband died in a car accident when Sarah was 12. I was the woman who worked 3 jobs to put Sarah through college, who sold my late husband's vintage car collection to pay for her graduate degree, who spent every weekend helping her study for the LSAT before she decided to pursue marketing instead. But to Marcus, I was just Sarah's mom, a woman whose modest home and practical car somehow reflected poorly on his image. He'd made comments before about my quaint little teacher lifestyle, always with that patronizing smile that suggested he was doing me a favor by acknowledging my existence. When Sarah got the job at his firm's marketing department, Marcus took credit for putting in a good word, conveniently forgetting that Sarah had earned her position through her own merit and the communication skills I'd spent years helping her develop. The wooden box sat on the gift table like a quiet rebuke to the crystal vases, silver picture frames, and expensive kitchen appliances that surrounded it. I'd chosen that specific box with deliberate care. It had belonged to my grandmother, a woman who'd survived the Depression by learning that true value often came disguised as something ordinary. She'd kept her most precious possessions in that box: my grandfather's wedding ring when he worked dangerous jobs, the deed to their first home, letters from her children during the war. "Helen," she used to tell me, "never judge what matters by what it looks like on the outside. The most important things in life rarely announce themselves." I thought about those words as I watched Marcus continue his performance, his arm draped possessively around Sarah's shoulders as he explained to anyone who'd listen how he planned to upgrade their lifestyle now that they were married. He talked about the house they'd eventually buy, the cars they'd drive, the vacations they'd take, all with the casual confidence of someone who'd never had to choose between paying rent and buying groceries. Sarah nodded along, but I could see the tension in her smile, the way she kept glancing toward the gift table where my modest offering sat among the more impressive displays. The mansion Marcus coveted wasn't just any house. It was the Henderson estate, a magnificent Victorian built in 1887 that sat on 2 acres of manicured gardens in the most prestigious neighborhood in our city. The house had been featured in architectural magazines, had hosted governors and senators, and had been in the Henderson family for 4 generations before financial troubles forced them to sell. Marcus had discovered it during one of his weekend drives through wealthy neighborhoods, a habit he'd developed to visualize his future success, as he liked to put it. For 3 years, he'd driven past that house every Sunday morning, sometimes stopping to take pictures of the wraparound porch, the turret windows, the carriage house that had been converted into a guest cottage. He'd shown me those pictures. Once, during a family dinner where he'd described in painful detail how he'd renovate each room, how he'd host parties for his colleagues, how owning that house would establish him as a serious player in the financial world. "It's not just about the house," he'd said, his eyes gleaming with ambition. "It's about what the house represents: legacy, success, power." What Marcus didn't know was that I'd been listening to his dreams for 3 years, filing away every detail, every passionate description of crown molding and hardwood floors. What he also didn't know was that my late husband had been far more than the factory worker Marcus assumed him to be. David Morrison had been an inventor, a quiet genius, who'd held 17 patents in manufacturing technology. When he died, those patents had been worth very little. But over the past 15 years, as technology evolved and manufacturing advanced, those patents had generated a steady stream of royalty payments that I'd quietly invested and reinvested. I wasn't the struggling teacher on a pension that Marcus believed me to be. I was a woman with a substantial investment portfolio, multiple rental properties, and enough liquid assets to buy his dream house 3 times over. But I'd learned long ago that money attracted people for the wrong reasons, so I lived modestly, drove a practical car, and let people make their own assumptions about my financial situation. It was a test, in a way. The people who treated me with respect, despite believing I had little, were the ones worth keeping in my life. Marcus had failed that test spectacularly and repeatedly. 6 months ago, when the Henderson estate had quietly gone on the market, I'd seen the listing before. It hit the public databases. The family wanted a discreet sale, and my real estate attorney had connections with their legal team. The asking price was $3 million, well within my means but astronomical for most buyers in our market. I'd toured the house on a Tuesday morning, walking through rooms that were even more magnificent than Marcus's stolen photographs had suggested. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The current owners, elderly siblings who'd inherited the property, had maintained it beautifully, but could no longer afford the upkeep. They wanted it to go to someone who'd appreciate its history, someone who understood that they weren't just buying a house, but becoming stewards of a legacy. As I stood in the grand foyer, looking up at the crystal chandelier that had illuminated dinner parties for over a century, I'd made my decision. I'd purchased the house not as an investment, not as a status symbol, but as a wedding gift for my daughter. The plan had been simple. Surprise Sarah and Marcus with the deed, watch their faces light up with joy and disbelief, and then step back and let them build their life in a place where dreams came true. I'd imagined family holidays in the formal dining room, grandchildren playing in the gardens, Sunday dinners where 3 generations could gather around the massive oak table in the breakfast nook. But plans change when people show you who they really are. The DJ announced the cake cutting, and I watched as Sarah and Marcus performed the traditional ceremony. Their hands joined on the silver knife as they sliced through 3 tiers of elegant white fondant. Marcus made a joke about Sarah's sweet tooth that got polite laughs from the crowd, but I noticed how his eyes kept scanning the room, cataloging who was watching, whose approval he was earning. Even on his wedding day, everything was a performance designed to enhance his image. After the cake, the dancing began, and I found myself standing at the edge of the dance floor, watching my daughter waltz with the man she'd chosen to spend her life with. Sarah looked beautiful in her grandmother's pearls and the vintage lace dress we'd found together at a boutique in the historic district. But there was something in her expression, a careful control that reminded me of myself during my own marriage to her father, back when I was still learning to navigate the difference between love and partnership. "Mrs. Morrison?" A young woman approached me, one of Sarah's college friends whose name I couldn't quite remember. "I just wanted to say thank you for the advice you gave me about teaching applications last year. I got the job at Riverside Elementary, and I love it." I smiled, genuinely pleased. "That's wonderful, Jessica. Teaching is a calling, not just a career. You'll touch more lives than you'll ever know." She beamed and hurried back to her friends, and I felt a familiar warmth that came from knowing I'd made a difference in someone's life. It was the same feeling I got when former students sent me graduation announcements, when they named their children after characters from books we'd read together, when they credited our discussions of literature with helping them navigate their own life challenges. That was my real wealth, the knowledge that I'd spent my career building something more valuable than money. I'd built minds, shaped character, and inspired young people to reach beyond what they thought possible. Marcus, with his expensive suits and his talk of power and legacy, would never understand that kind of success. The evening wore on, and eventually, the gift opening began. Sarah and Marcus sat at a decorated table while their wedding party brought them presents to unwrap. I watched from my seat as they exclaimed over crystal stemware, admired kitchen appliances, and thanked guests for their generosity. The pile of gifts was impressive, clearly representing thousands of dollars worth of carefully chosen items from their registry. When they reached my wooden box, Marcus picked it up with the same dismissive expression he'd worn earlier. "Let's see what treasures await us in here," he said, his tone making it clear that he expected nothing of value. Sarah's face was carefully neutral as she lifted the lid, but I saw her eyebrows rise slightly when she saw the contents. Instead of jewelry, the box contained a single folded document sealed in a protective plastic sleeve, along with a small brass key attached to a ribbon. Marcus frowned, clearly expecting something more dramatic. "What is it?" someone called out from the crowd. Sarah unfolded the document carefully, her eyes scanning the legal text. I watched as confusion gave way to shock, then to something that might have been awe. Her hands trembled slightly as she read the property description, the legal details, the transfer of ownership that made her and Marcus the new owners of 1247 Magnolia Avenue, also known as the Henderson Estate. "Sarah?" Marcus prompted, leaning over to look at the papers. "What is it?" My daughter looked up at me across the crowded reception hall, her eyes wide with disbelief. For a moment, the noise of the party faded, and it was just the two of us. Mother and daughter, connected by years of struggle and sacrifice and love that didn't need words to be understood. "It's a house," Sarah said quietly, her voice barely carrying over the music. "Mom bought us a house." Marcus snatched the deed from her hands, his expression shifting from boredom to confusion to something approaching panic as he read the address. I knew the exact moment he realized what he was holding because his face went completely white, and the paper crinkled in his suddenly unsteady grip. "This is 1247 Magnolia," he whispered, and for the first time since I'd known him, Marcus Thompson was completely speechless. The Henderson Estate, the house he'd dreamed about for 3 years, the mansion he'd never thought he could afford, was now legally his. And it had come from the woman he'd just humiliated for her cheap gift. The irony wasn't lost on me, and judging by the stunned silence that had fallen over the bridal party table, it wasn't lost on anyone else either. Marcus looked from the, deed to the wooden box to me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. The confident, condescending man who'd mocked my gift 20 minutes earlier had been replaced by someone who looked like he might faint. But I wasn't finished. This was just the beginning of a lesson that Marcus Thompson desperately needed to learn about judging people by appearances, about treating others with respect, regardless of their perceived value, and about the consequences. of choosing arrogance over gratitude. The deed in his hands was real, but whether he'd get to keep it was an entirely different question. The night was young, and I had plans. The silence stretched across the reception hall like a held breath, broken only by the distant sound of the jazz quartet still playing in the corner, oblivious to the drama unfolding at the head table. Marcus stared at the deed in his hands as if it might disappear if he blinked, while Sarah sat frozen beside him, her wedding dress suddenly feeling heavy and constricting. I remained in my seat, hands folded calmly in my lap, watching the ripple effects of revelation spread through the wedding party like stones thrown into still water. "Helen," Marcus finally managed, his voice cracking slightly on my name. For the first time in 2 years, he wasn't calling me Sarah's mom or Mrs. Morrison, with that particular inflection that made my name sound like an inconvenience. "I don't understand. How did you—" "This house costs $2.3 million," I said quietly, my voice carrying clearly in the stunned silence. "I know because I paid cash for it 6 months ago." The words hit the table like a physical blow. Marcus's best man, a fellow investment banker named Trevor, who'd spent the entire evening bragging about his quarterly bonuses, choked on his champagne. Sarah's maid of honor, her college roommate Lisa, dropped her fork with a clatter that seemed to echo through the suddenly quiet space around us. Marcus's mother, Patricia Thompson, who'd spent the cocktail hour making thinly veiled comments about Sarah marrying down and how unfortunate it was that her son's new mother-in-law was just a teacher, looked like she'd been slapped. Her perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide the flush creeping up her neck as she realized she'd been condescending to a woman who could have bought her suburban McMansion with pocket change. "Cash?" Trevor repeated weakly, his voice barely above, a whisper. "You paid cash for the Henderson estate?" I nodded, allowing myself a small smile. The sellers preferred a quick, clean transaction. No financing complications, no lengthy approval processes. Just a straightforward purchase from someone who could appreciate the property's historical significance. Sarah found her voice first, though it trembled with emotion. "Mom, I don't understand. You work at Jefferson High. You drive that old Honda. Your apartment." She trailed off, the pieces of a puzzle she'd never known existed suddenly rearranging themselves in her mind. "My apartment is comfortable and sufficient for my needs," I replied gently. "I've never believed that happiness comes from impressing others with expensive possessions. But I've also never believed in living beyond my means or pretending to be something I'm not." The distinction hung in the air like an accusation, and Marcus had the grace to look ashamed, though whether it was genuine remorse or embarrassment at being caught in his prejudices remained to be seen. His face had regained some color, but his hands still shook slightly as he held the deed, as if he couldn't quite believe it was real. "The patents," Sarah said suddenly, her eyes widening with understanding. "Dad's patents. You always said they weren't worth much, but—" "Your father was a brilliant man who never got the recognition he deserved while he was alive," I said, my voice softening at the memory of David's quiet genius. "He always told me that his real legacy wouldn't be measured in dollars, but in the innovations that would improve people's lives long after he was gone. He was right, as usual." What I didn't tell them was the full extent of David's vision, or how his seemingly simple improvements to manufacturing processes had become the foundation for technologies that were now used in everything from medical devices to aerospace applications. I didn't mention the quarterly royalty checks that had grown larger each year as his innovations found new applications, or how I'd invested every penny with the same careful precision David had applied to his inventions. Instead, I had spent the last 15 years living modestly while building a financial foundation that could weather any storm. I'd learned about investments and real estate, about tax strategies and estate planning. I'd turned David's intellectual legacy into something that could provide security for generations of our family. But I'd also learned to keep that success private because I'd seen how money changed relationships, how it attracted the wrong kind of attention, and drove away people who might otherwise value you for who you were, rather than what you owned. Marcus was beginning to recover from his shock, and I could see his mind working, calculating what this gift meant for his future, his status, his carefully constructed image of success. "Helen, we can't possibly accept something this generous. It's too much." The words sounded right, but his tone betrayed him. He didn't want to refuse the house. He wanted to be seen as gracious enough to offer the refusal, while secretly hoping I'd insist he keep it. It was a performance, just like everything else about Marcus Thompson, and I was tired of watching his shows. "You're absolutely right," I said, my voice pleasant and conversational. "It is too much." Sarah's face fell, and I saw genuine disappointment there, not for the monetary value of the gift, but for the symbol it represented. Her mother's faith in her marriage, her future, her choices. That disappointment hurt more than Marcus's earlier. Cruelty, because it reminded me that my daughter had been caught in the crossfire of a lesson she didn't deserve to learn. "However," I continued, reaching into my purse and pulling out a second envelope, this one crisp and new, "I believe in giving people the opportunity to prove they deserve the gifts they've been offered." I handed the envelope to Sarah, not Marcus, and watched as she opened it with careful fingers. Inside was a contract, professionally drafted and legally binding, outlining the terms under which they could retain ownership of the Henderson estate. "What is this?" Marcus demanded, leaning over to read the document, his earlier humility evaporating as quickly as it had appeared. "It's a character test," I said simply. "The house is yours, legally and completely, as of today. The deed is valid, and there are no liens or encumbrances against the property. However, there are conditions attached to my ongoing financial support." Sarah read aloud, her voice growing stronger with each word. "The recipients agree to demonstrate respect, kindness, and gratitude in all their interactions with Helen Morrison and other family members. They agree to contribute meaningfully to their community through volunteer work or charitable giving. They agree to host family gatherings at least 4 times per year and to maintain the property's historical integrity." "There's more," I added, as Sarah turned the page. "You'll also be responsible for all taxes, insurance, utilities, and maintenance costs. The house is expensive to own, not just expensive to buy. Property taxes alone are $43,000 per year. The heating bill in winter can reach $800 per month. The roof will need to be replaced within the next 5 years at an estimated cost of $60,000. I watched Marcus's face pale again as the financial reality of owning his dream house became clear. This wasn't just a gift. It was a responsibility that would require them to step up in ways they'd never had to before. "But Mom," Sarah protested, "we can't afford those kinds of expenses. Marcus just started at the firm and my salary at the marketing company." "Which is exactly why you'll need to think carefully about whether you want to accept this gift," I said gently. "I could cover those expenses for you, but that would defeat the purpose of the lesson. If you want to live in a house that represents success and status, you need to earn the right to maintain it." Marcus was doing calculations in his head, and I could see the moment he realized that owning the Henderson estate might actually leave them financially worse off than they were in their current apartment. His dream house was beautiful, but it was also a financial burden that would require him to excel at his job, to earn promotions and bonuses, to become the successful man he'd always pretended to be. "There's another option," I continued, pulling out a third document. "You can sell the house immediately. The market is strong, and you'd likely get close to what I paid for it. That money, invested wisely, could provide you with a very comfortable life. A nice house in a good neighborhood, college funds for future children, early retirement if you're smart about it." Sarah looked between the deed and the contract, understanding dawning in her eyes. This wasn't just about money or houses or even about Marcus's behavior at the reception. This was about choices, about the difference between earning something and simply being given it, about the responsibility that comes with privilege. "You're making us choose," Sarah said quietly. "I'm giving you the opportunity to choose." Corrected. There's a difference. For years, Marcus has talked about the kind of life he wants to live, the success he wants to achieve, the legacy he wants to build. Now, he has the chance to prove whether those were dreams worth pursuing, or just fantasies that sound impressive at cocktail parties. Marcus had been silent during this exchange, but I could see the war happening behind his eyes. His pride warred with his practicality, his image with his reality. The Henderson estate was everything he'd said he wanted, but actually owning it would require him to become everything he'd only pretended to be. "What about the character clause?" he asked finally, his voice carefully controlled. "Who decides whether we're meeting those standards?" "I do," I said simply. "But I'm not unreasonable, Marcus. I don't expect perfection. I expect growth. I expect you to treat people with respect regardless of their perceived status. I expect you to contribute something meaningful to the world beyond your own success. I expect you to remember that true wealth isn't about what you own. It's about what you give." The reception continued around us, but our table had become an island of intensity in a sea of celebration. Other guests were dancing, laughing, enjoying the open bar and the elaborate dinner that Marcus's parents had insisted on paying for as a demonstration of their family's success. They had no idea that the real drama of the evening was playing, out at the head table, where a teacher in a modest dress was delivering a masterclass in power dynamics to a young man who'd spent his entire adult life believing that confidence and appearance were the same thing as competence and character. Patricia Thompson, who had been listening to our conversation with growing alarm, finally found her voice. "Helen, I think there might be some misunderstanding here. Marcus is a good man from a good family. He doesn't need to prove his character to anyone." I turned to face her, this woman who'd spent the entire evening treating me like hired help, who'd made comments about Sarah's modest background and how fortunate she was to be marrying into the Thompson family. Patricia Thompson, who lived in a house that was impressive by suburban standards, but would fit comfortably in the Henderson estate's guest wing. "Patricia," I said, my voice warm but firm, "I'm sure you raised Marcus to the best of your ability. But character isn't something you inherit or something you can buy. It's something you demonstrate every day through your choices, your actions, and how you treat other people, especially people you think can't do anything for you." The words hit their target, and Patricia's face flushed again. She'd been dismissive of me all evening, and now she was realizing that the woman she'd looked down on could have bought her family's lifestyle several times over without making a dent in her financial portfolio. "The clock is ticking," I continued, looking back at Marcus and Sarah. "The longer you take to decide, the more expensive the choice becomes. Property taxes are due quarterly, and the first payment is next month. The insurance premium is annual, due at closing. The heating system is 30 years old and will likely need major repairs before winter." Sarah reached for Marcus's hand, and I saw them exchange a look that contained years of conversations about money, status, dreams, and reality. This was their first major decision as a married couple, and it would set the tone for everything. That came after. "Can we have some time to think about it?" Sarah asked. "Of course," I replied. "But not too much time. The house is in your name now, which means you're legally responsible for all associated costs starting today. Every day you wait to decide is another day of expenses accumulating." Marcus cleared his throat, his confidence slowly returning, as he found his footing in this new reality. "Helen, I want you to know that I appreciate this gift more than I can possibly express. The Henderson estate has been my dream for years, and the fact that you would be so generous—" "Marcus," I interrupted gently, "stop performing for me. I'm not your audience anymore. The people you need to impress are the ones who will judge whether you deserve to keep living in that house. Your neighbors, who have worked their entire lives to afford their homes in that neighborhood. The historical society, who will expect you to maintain the property's integrity. The community, who will watch to see whether you contribute anything meaningful or just consume the privileges that come with your address. The truth was, I'd designed this gift to be a mirror, reflecting back exactly who Marcus and Sarah chose, to be when faced with real responsibility. If they rose to the challenge, they'd earn something far more valuable than a beautiful house. They'd earn the confidence that comes from knowing you deserve what you have. If they couldn't handle the pressure, they'd learn an equally valuable lesson about the difference between wanting something and being ready for it. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Marcus and Sarah sat with the deed, the contract, and the weight of a decision that would shape their entire future. I gathered my purse and shawl, preparing to leave them to their choice, but Sarah caught my arm as I stood. "Mom," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm sorry about earlier, about Marcus's reaction to your gift. It was cruel and unnecessary." I covered her hand with mine, feeling the slim gold wedding band that had belonged to my own mother. "Apologies are just words, sweetheart. What matters now is what you both choose to do next." As I walked toward the exit, I heard Marcus call my name. I turned to see him standing beside his wife, the deed still clutched in his hands, his expression more serious than I'd ever seen it. "Helen," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the reception hall. "I was wrong tonight. About the gift. About you. About a lot of things. I don't know if we can handle everything that comes with this house, but I promise you this. If we keep it, we'll earn the right to live there. And if we can't, we'll have the honesty to admit it." It wasn't the apology I'd been expecting, but it was something potentially more valuable, a commitment to growth. Whether Marcus could follow through remained to be seen, but for the first time since I'd met him, he sounded like a man who understood that actions mattered more than words. The valet brought my Honda around, and I smiled at the young man's careful courtesy as he held the door for me. He had no idea that the woman driving the 15-year-old sedan could afford to buy the luxury cars parked around it, and that was exactly how I preferred it. True security came from being underestimated, from letting people make assumptions while you quietly built something real and lasting. As I drove home through streets lined with modest houses where good people lived honest lives, I thought about the choice I'd given Marcus and Sarah. It wasn't really about money or houses or even about punishment for his earlier cruelty. It was about the kind of people they wanted to become, and whether they had the courage to grow into the adults their dreams required them to be. The wooden box that had started this evening's drama sat empty on the passenger seat beside me, but it had served its purpose. Sometimes the most valuable gifts come in the humblest packages, and sometimes the greatest kindness you can show someone is giving them the chance to prove they deserve what they've been offered. Tomorrow, Marcus and Sarah would begin learning whether they were ready for the responsibility that comes with getting everything you think you want. And I would continue living the quiet, purposeful life I'd built, secure in the knowledge that I'd given them the most important gift of all, the opportunity to discover who they really were when nobody was watching and everything was on the line. The first sign that Marcus and Sarah had chosen to keep the Henderson estate came 3 days after the wedding, when I received a formal thank you note written in Sarah's careful handwriting. The cream-colored stationery was expensive, probably purchased specifically for this purpose, and the message was brief but significant. "Dear Mom, we've decided to accept your generous gift and the responsibilities that come with it. We hope to make you proud. Love, Sarah and Marcus." What the note didn't convey was the panic I knew they must be feeling as the reality of their decision settled in. I'd done my research on Marcus's salary at Henderson & Associates, and even with Sarah's income from the marketing firm, They were looking at a monthly budget that would stretch them to their absolute limits. The property taxes alone would consume nearly 20% of their combined take-home pay, and that was before factoring in utilities, insurance, maintenance, and the daily expenses of living in a neighborhood where a gallon of milk cost twice what it did in other parts of town. But I also knew something they didn't. Struggle builds character in ways that comfort never can. Some of my strongest students had been the ones who worked jobs after school, who understood the value of every dollar, who knew that success was something you earned rather than something you were entitled to. Marcus had spent his entire adult life believing that appearance was everything, that the right clothes and the right car and the right address would automatically command respect. Now he was about to learn that respect was something you earned through your actions, not your possessions. The second sign came a week later, when I drove past the estate on my way to visit my friend Margaret, who lived in the historic district. The moving trucks were gone, replaced by Marcus's BMW and Sarah's compact car looking oddly out of place in the circular driveway designed for carriages and luxury vehicles. But what caught my attention wasn't the cars. It was Marcus himself, dressed in old jeans and a paint-stained t-shirt, power washing the front steps with the kind of intensity that suggested he was working off frustration as much as grime. I slowed my Honda as I passed, and Marcus looked up from his work. For a moment, our eyes met through my car window, and I saw something I'd never seen in his face before: humility. He raised his hand in a tentative wave, and I nodded back before continuing down Magnolia Avenue. It was a small interaction, but it represented a seismic shift in the dynamic between us. For the first time since I'd known him, Marcus Thompson was doing physical labor on property he couldn't afford to hire someone else to maintain. The third sign came 2 weeks after that, when Sarah called me on a Thursday evening, her voice tight with exhaustion and something that might have been panic. "Mom," she said without preamble, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." I set down my tea and settled into my reading chair, recognizing the tone of someone who'd reached a breaking point. "What is it?" "Sweetheart? When you gave us the house, did you know it would be this hard?" The question hung between us like a confession. Sarah had always been proud, even as a child, reluctant to admit when she was struggling or needed help. For her to ask this question meant she was genuinely overwhelmed, and part of me wanted to rush over with my checkbook and solve all their problems immediately. Instead, I chose the harder path: the truth. "Yes," I said simply. I knew exactly how difficult it would be. Silence stretched across the phone line, and I could hear Sarah breathing, processing the implications of my answer. "Did you want us to fail?" she asked finally, her voice small and hurt. "I wanted you to succeed," I replied. "But I wanted you to succeed because you earned it, not because it was handed to you. There's a difference between struggling and failing, Sarah. Struggling builds strength. Failing only happens when you give up." "Marcus is working 16-hour days," she said, and I could hear tears in her voice. "He's taken on 3 extra clients, and he's studying for his Series 7 certification at night because his boss said it would open up more opportunities. He gets home at midnight and he's back at the office by 6 in the morning. I barely see him." "And how is he treating people?" I asked, because that was the real test. Sarah was quiet for a moment. "Better," she admitted. "Different. Last week he thanked the cleaning lady at his office by name and asked about her daughter's graduation. Yesterday, he helped our elderly neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, carry her groceries up her front steps. I don't know, Mom. He's becoming someone I didn't know he could be." I smiled, feeling a warmth in my chest that had nothing to do with my tea. "And what about you? How are you handling the pressure?" "I'm terrified," Sarah said, laughing through what sounded like tears. "I've never been responsible for something this valuable, this important. Do you know that our house is on the historical registry?" That means if we damage anything original, we could face fines from the city. The crown molding in the dining room is hand-carved from 1887. The hardwood floors are original heart pine. I'm afraid to walk through my own home without slippers because I might scratch something that can't be replaced. But you're learning, I said gently. You're learning that some things in life are worth being careful with, worth protecting, worth preserving for future generations. That's not a burden, Sarah, that's a privilege. The heating bill last month was $738, she continued, and I could hear the stress in her voice. $700, Mom, just to keep the house warm. Marcus said we might have to choose between heating the whole house and having money for groceries. What did you decide? We're only heating the rooms we actually use, and we bought extra blankets and space heaters for the bedrooms. Marcus jokes that we're living like college students in a mansion, but honestly, it's not that bad. We've been spending more time together in the evenings because we're all gathered in the living room where the fireplace is. We actually talk now, instead of just watching TV in separate rooms. There was something in her voice, a note of discovery, that made my heart lift. This was what I'd hoped for. Not just the struggle, but the growth that came from facing challenges together, from learning that luxury wasn't about having everything you wanted, but about appreciating what you had. There's something else, Sarah said, her voice growing stronger. We've been getting involved with the neighborhood association. Mrs. Patterson, our neighbor, she's been the president for 15 years, and she's teaching us about the history of the area, about the other families who've lived in these houses for generations. Marcus has been helping with their fundraiser for the community garden, and I've volunteered to design their newsletter. It feels like we're becoming part of something bigger than ourselves. This was the transformation I'd been hoping to see. Marcus and Sarah weren't just living in an expensive house. They were becoming members of a community, contributing. Something meaningful instead of just consuming the privileges of their address. I'm proud of you both, I said, and meant it. It sounds like you're learning that a house becomes a home when you invest yourself in it, not just your money. We've also been talking about having children, Sarah said, her voice soft with wonder. Before, when we lived in the apartment, it felt like we were still playing house, like we weren't really grown-ups yet. But now, walking through these rooms, where families lived for generations, thinking about the children who played in the garden and learned to walk on these floors, it makes parenthood feel real, feel possible. The nursery on the 3rd floor has the most beautiful view of the garden, I said, remembering my tour of the house. The morning light comes through those tall windows like a blessing. You've been in the house? Sarah asked, surprised. I toured it before I bought it, I explained. I wanted to make sure it was worthy of my daughter and her family. Even after the way Marcus treated you at the wedding? I was quiet for a moment, choosing my words carefully. I didn't buy the house for Marcus as he was, Sarah. I bought it for the man I hoped he could become. Sometimes people need the right motivation to discover their best selves. He's been asking about Dad, Sarah said suddenly. About his inventions, about how you built your success. I think he's finally understanding that there's more than one way to measure wealth, more than one way to build a legacy. This was perhaps the most encouraging news of all. Marcus's curiosity about David's work suggested he was beginning to understand that true achievement came from creating something valuable, not just accumulating expensive possessions. Your father would have liked seeing Marcus work with his hands, I said. David always believed that there was dignity in any honest work, whether you were building bridges or balancing books or teaching children to read. Speaking of teaching, Sarah said, her voice brightening, I have news. I've been accepted into the graduate program at the university. I'm going to get my master's in education. The marketing job pays well, but it's not fulfilling. I want to do something that matters. I felt tears prick my eyes. Sarah had always been drawn to teaching when she was younger, but she'd chosen marketing because it promised better financial prospects. Now, with the security of the house behind her, she was free to pursue her real passion. The program is mostly evening and weekend classes, she continued. I can keep working while I study, and Marcus has been incredibly supportive. He says he wants our children to have a mother who loves what she does for work, not just someone who earns a paycheck. When do you start? Fall semester. I'm nervous but excited. I keep thinking about the difference you made in your students' lives, about the way they still write to you and visit you years after graduation. I want to be that kind of teacher, the kind who changes people's lives. You will be, I said with absolute certainty. You have your father's mind and your own generous heart. That's a powerful combination. We talked for another hour, and by the time we hung up, I felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with proving a point or teaching a lesson. My daughter and her husband were growing, struggling, becoming better versions of themselves because they'd been given the opportunity to rise to a challenge rather than coast through life on unearned advantages. The real test came a month later, when Margaret called to tell me about the Henderson estate's first major crisis as the Thompson residence. Helen, she said, her voice tight with concern, you need to know what happened at your daughter's house yesterday. I set down my coffee, immediately alert. What kind of thing? There was a burst pipe in the basement. Not just any pipe, one of the main water lines that feeds the whole house. The basement flooded, and water damage went up into the first floor. I drove past this morning, and there were restoration trucks in the driveway. My first instinct was to drive over immediately, to assess the damage and write whatever checks were necessary to fix everything perfectly. But I forced myself to stay seated, to let Marcus and Sarah handle their first real homeowner crisis without my intervention. How bad was the damage? I asked. I'm not sure, but I saw them carrying out rugs and furniture. It looked serious. That evening, Sarah called me, and I could hear exhaustion and stress in every word. Mom, I don't know what we're going to do, she said without preamble. The insurance will cover some of the damage, but there's a $20,000 deductible, and that's money we just don't have. The restoration company says we need to act fast to prevent mold, but the emergency repairs alone will cost more than we make in 3 months. I waited, letting her finish before I responded. Marcus has been on the phone all day trying to get quotes from different contractors, looking for payment plans, anything that might make this manageable. He even called his parents to ask for a loan, which I know killed his pride, but they can't help with that kind of money. What did the insurance adjuster say about the cause? It was just age and wear. The house is old, and even though it's been maintained well, sometimes things just fail. The adjuster said it's actually pretty common in houses from that era. I took a deep breath, knowing that what I said next would determine not just whether they kept the house, but whether they learned the lesson I'd been trying to teach them. Sarah, I said carefully, you have options. You could sell the house and use the proceeds to pay for the repairs, then buy something smaller and more manageable. You could declare bankruptcy and let the bank deal with the property, or you could find a way to rise to this challenge and prove that you deserve to live in a house that tests your character. But how? She asked, and I could hear tears in her voice. We're already stretched to our limits. The same way people have always solved problems when money isn't the answer, I said, with creativity, determination, and community. I don't understand. Ask for help, but offer something in return. Marcus has skills. He's good with numbers, with planning, with organization. You have skills too: communication, design, project management. The neighborhood is full of people who've faced similar challenges. Mrs. Patterson has lived through 2 major renovations. The Hendersons who sold you the house might have advice about managing repair costs. This doesn't have to be something you face alone. There was silence on the other end of the line, and I could almost hear Sarah thinking. You're not going to bail us out, are you? She said finally. I'm going to let you discover how strong you are, I replied. I'm going to let you learn that the most valuable things in life are the ones you fight for, not the ones you're given. And if we fail, if we can't make it work, then you'll have learned something equally valuable, that it's better to try and fail at something meaningful than to succeed at something that doesn't matter. But Sarah, I don't think you're going to fail. I think you and Marcus are about to discover reserves of strength and resourcefulness you didn't know you had. After we hung up, I sat in my quiet apartment and thought about the difference between helping and enabling, between love and rescue. The hardest part of parenting isn't protecting your children from challenges. It's giving them the space to grow into people who can handle whatever life throws at them. 3 days later, Sarah called again, and this time her voice was bright with excitement and something that sounded like pride. "Mom, you'll never guess what happened," she said. "Marcus organized a neighborhood work party. Mrs. Patterson put the word out through the Historical Society, and 12 families showed up on Saturday with tools and supplies. Mr. Chen, who lives 3 houses down, is a retired contractor, and he's been supervising the repairs. The Williamses brought lunch for everyone. Even the teenager from across the street came over with his friends to help move furniture." I smiled, feeling warmth spread through my chest. "And what did you and Marcus contribute?" "Marcus is doing all the financial planning and coordination with the insurance company, and I'm documenting everything for the Historical Society's newsletter and creating a guide for other homeowners who might face similar challenges. We're not just fixing our house, Mom. We're building relationships, creating resources, becoming the kind of neighbors we want to have." "How are the repairs coming along?" "Better than we hoped. Mr. Chen says we might actually end up with improvements to the original plumbing system, and the total cost is going to be about 60% of what the first contractor quoted us. But more than that, we've learned so much about our house, our neighborhood, our community. Marcus keeps saying it's like we finally understand what it means to be stewards of something bigger than ourselves." "And how do you feel about that?" "Grateful," Sarah said without hesitation. "Grateful for the challenge, grateful for the neighbors who stepped up to help, grateful for the chance to prove that we belong here not because we can afford it, but because we're willing to work for it." As I hung up the phone, I realized that my gift to Marcus and Sarah had been successful in ways I'd never anticipated. I'd given them more than a house. I'd given them the opportunity to discover that real wealth came not from what you owned, but from what you contributed, not from what you could afford, but from what you were willing to sacrifice for something you believed in. The wooden box that had started this whole journey sat on my bookshelf now, empty but not forgotten. It had served its purpose, delivering a lesson more valuable than any deed or dollar amount. That the most important gifts in life are the ones that challenge us to become better than we thought possible. And Marcus and Sarah were just getting started. 6 months after the flood crisis, I received an invitation that stopped me in my tracks. The cream-colored envelope bore the Henderson Estates return address, but the handwriting was Marcus's. Careful script, rather than Sarah's familiar cursive. Inside was a formal invitation to what they called the first annual Henderson Estate Community Heritage Festival, scheduled for the first weekend in October. The invitation was beautifully designed, featuring a watercolor sketch of the house that I recognized as Sarah's artistic work. But what truly caught my attention was the small note handwritten at the bottom. "Helen, this event exists because of the lesson you taught us about stewardship and community. We hope you'll join us in celebrating what we've all built together. With gratitude and love, Marcus and Sarah." I called Sarah that evening, curious about this unexpected development. "Mom," she answered on the first ring, her voice bubbling with excitement. "Did you get the invitation? Are you coming? Please say you're coming." "I wouldn't miss it," I said, settling into my reading chair. "But I have to admit, I'm curious about how a heritage festival came to be." "It was Marcus's idea, actually. Sarah said, and I could hear the pride in her voice. After the flood brought all the neighbors together, he started researching the history of our street, of all the families who've lived in these houses over the decades. Did you know that during World War II, Mrs. Patterson's house was used as a meeting place for organizing rationing efforts? And the Victorian next to us was owned by a suffragette who hosted planning meetings for women's voting rights. I smiled, recognizing the passion in Sarah's voice that I remembered from her childhood, when she would become completely absorbed in learning about something that captured her imagination. Marcus presented the idea to the neighborhood association. She continued. He said that we all live in houses with stories, and those stories connect us not just to the past but to each other. The festival is going to celebrate that history while raising money for neighborhood improvements. What kind of improvements? Playground equipment for the small park at the end of the street, restoration of the original brick crosswalks, and funding for a neighborhood emergency fund to help families who face unexpected repair costs like we did. Marcus calls it community insurance, the idea that we all contribute to help each other when life throws curveballs. The transformation. Marcus continued to amaze me. The man who had once mocked my gift was now organizing community events and creating mutual aid systems. But what impressed me most was that his growth seemed genuine, born from experience rather than calculation. How is Marcus handling all this extra responsibility? I asked, between work and the festival planning. That's the thing, Mom. He's thriving. He got promoted at the firm last month, senior associate with a substantial raise. His boss said it was because Marcus had developed leadership skills and community awareness that made him more valuable to clients who want to work with people who understand long-term thinking and relationship building. I felt a surge of satisfaction that had nothing to do with being proven right. Marcus's professional success was coming as a direct result of the character development he'd been forced to undergo, proving that authentic growth created opportunities that performance and posturing never could. And you? How is the graduate program going? I love it, Sarah said, her voice warm with contentment. I'm taking a class on community-based education, and I've been using our neighborhood as a case study. My professor wants me to present our Heritage Festival model at the State Education Conference as an example of how communities can become living classrooms. The pride in her voice was infectious, and I found myself smiling as I listened to my daughter describe the intersection of her academic work with her real-world experiences. This was the kind of learning that changed people permanently, the kind that integrated knowledge with purpose. There's something else, Sarah continued, her voice dropping to a more intimate tone. Marcus and I have been talking about starting a family. We feel ready now, in a way we never did before. We know who we are, we know what we can handle, and we know we have a community that will support us. I closed my eyes, feeling a deep well of emotion. This was what I'd hoped for when I'd given them the house, not just the building itself, but the life that the responsibility would force them to create. The festival weekend arrived with perfect October weather. Crisp air, brilliant blue, skies and trees showing off their full autumn glory. I arrived at the Henderson estate to find Magnolia Avenue transformed into something magical. The entire street had been closed to traffic, and each house had become a different station in a neighborhood-wide celebration. The Henderson estate itself served as the festival headquarters, with information tables set up on the wraparound porch and historical displays filling the front garden. I spotted Marcus immediately, dressed in khakis and a button-down shirt, directing volunteers with the kind of confident authority that came from actual competence rather than assumed privilege. "Helen!" he called when he saw me, jogging over with a genuine smile that transformed his entire face. "Thank you so much for coming. I have something I want to show you." He led me to a display table covered with photographs, documents, and artifacts. The centerpiece was a leather-bound book titled The Stories of Magnolia Avenue, a Living History Project. Every house on the street is represented, Marcus explained, opening the book to reveal beautifully designed pages combining historical research with contemporary family stories. We interviewed long-term residents, researched property records, even found old photographs in the city archives. But this page is special. He turned to a section titled The Morrison Legacy Teaching, Generations. The page featured a photograph of me from my early teaching days, surrounded by pictures of former students who had gone on to become teachers, doctors, artists, and community leaders. But what took my breath away was the essay beneath the photos, written in Marcus's clear prose. Helen Morrison represents the kind of wealth that doesn't appear on tax records or property assessments, I read aloud. Her true fortune lies in the minds she's shaped, the confidence she's built, and the ripple effects of education that continue to spread through our community decades after her students left her classroom. She understands that the most valuable gifts are often the ones that challenge us to become better than we thought possible. I looked up at Marcus, seeing something in his eyes that I'd never seen before. Not just respect, but understanding. He wasn't just acknowledging my contribution. He was demonstrating that he'd internalized the lesson I'd been trying to teach him. Marcus, I said softly, this is beautiful. But why? Because I want everyone to know the kind of woman who chose to trust us with her gift, he replied. I want them to understand that living in this house isn't just about owning something beautiful. It's about continuing a legacy of generosity and wisdom. Before I could respond, Sarah appeared at my elbow, glowing with excitement and something else that made my heart skip. Mom, there's someone I want you to meet, she said, her hand resting unconsciously on her still flat stomach. Mrs. Chen, this is my mother, Helen Morrison. Mom, Mrs. Chen taught 4th grade for 45 years before she retired. She's been telling me stories about some of her former students who are now teachers themselves. Mrs. Chen, a tiny woman with bright eyes and a warm smile, took my hands in hers. Mrs. Morrison, your daughter has been telling me about your teaching career. It's so wonderful to meet another educator who understands that we're not just teaching subjects. We're teaching young people how to think, how to question, how to grow. As we talked, I learned that Mrs. Chen had been the driving force behind several community education initiatives, that she'd started a tutoring program for struggling students, and that she'd been looking for someone to help expand the program into literacy work with adult learners. Would you be interested in volunteering? She asked. We could use someone with your experience and wisdom. I found myself saying yes before I'd fully considered what I was agreeing to. But something about Mrs. Chen's passion and the way Sarah beamed at my response told me this was exactly the kind of opportunity I'd been unconsciously seeking. The festival continued around us, and I spent the afternoon moving from house to house, learning stories that painted a picture of a community that had weathered decades of change while maintaining its essential character. At the Victorian, where the suffragette had lived, a display showed photographs of women's rights meetings held in the very parlor that now served as a family's living room. At Mrs. Patterson's house, wartime rationing recipes were being served, alongside stories of neighborhood cooperation during difficult times. But what struck me most was how naturally Marcus and Sarah had integrated themselves into this tapestry of stories. They weren't outsiders trying to buy their way into an established community. They had become genuine contributors to its ongoing narrative. As the afternoon wound down, I found myself in the Henderson Estates garden, where a small stage had been set up for closing remarks. Marcus stepped up to the microphone, and the crowd of neighbors, families, and visitors gradually quieted. A year ago, he began, his voice carrying clearly across the garden. My wife and I moved into this house thinking we were just acquiring a beautiful piece of property. We had no idea we were being entrusted with a piece of living history or that owning this house would teach us what it really means to be part of a community. He paused, his eyes finding mine in the crowd. We learned that true ownership isn't about having the deed to a property. It's about earning the right to be stewards of something bigger than yourself. It's about understanding that with privilege comes responsibility, and that the most valuable things in life are the ones we build together. The crowd applauded, but Marcus raised his hand to continue. This festival raised over $12,000 for neighborhood improvements, but more importantly, it strengthened connections between families who might otherwise have remained strangers. We've proven that a community is only as strong as its willingness to invest in each other. Sarah joined him on the stage, her hand finding his as she stepped up to the microphone. Next year, she announced, the Heritage Festival will expand to include an oral history project where high school students will interview neighborhood elders to preserve their stories for future generations. We're also planning a community garden where families can grow food together and learn from each other about sustainable living. The applause was warm and sustained, but what moved me most was the genuine affection I could see in the faces of the neighbors who had gathered. Marcus and Sarah hadn't just thrown a successful event, they had created something that brought people together in meaningful ways. As the crowd began to disperse, Sarah approached me with that particular glow that I was beginning to recognize. "Mom," she said, taking my hands, "Marcus and I have news we want to share with you first." I looked at her radiant face and felt my heart lift with anticipation. "We're pregnant," she said, tears of joy sparkling in her eyes. "The baby is due in May, right when the garden will be in full bloom." I pulled her into my arms, feeling the completion of a circle that had begun with my own pregnancy 32 years earlier. This grandchild would grow up in the house I'd gifted, surrounded by the community that Marcus and Sarah had helped to strengthen, with parents who understood the difference between privilege and responsibility. "Have you thought about names?" I asked, my voice thick with emotion. "If it's a girl," Sarah said, glancing at Marcus, "we'd like to call her Helen. Helen Patricia Thompson. Patricia after Marcus's mother, but Helen because we want her to grow up understanding that true wealth comes from the lives you touch, not the things you own." I looked at Marcus, this man who had once mocked my simple gift, who had learned through struggle and community what it meant to be worthy of the blessings he'd received. "And if it's a boy?" I asked. "David Marcus," Marcus replied. "After your husband, whose innovations continue to benefit people he never met. We want our son to understand that the best legacies are built by creating something that outlasts your own life." As the sun set over Magnolia Avenue, painting the Victorian houses in shades of gold and amber, I realized that my gift to Marcus and Sarah had come full circle. The house had been just the beginning, a catalyst for transformation that had exceeded my wildest hopes. 6 months later, I stood in the same garden where the Heritage Festival had taken place. But this time I was holding my granddaughter, Helen Patricia Thompson, while Sarah recovered from an easy labor in the master bedroom where generations of babies had been born. Marcus approached us, his face soft with wonder as he looked at his daughter. "Helen," he said, his voice gentle with respect and affection, "would you like to be the first person to officially welcome Helen Patricia to the Henderson estate?" I looked down at the tiny face, so perfect and peaceful, and thought about all the gifts we give our children, some intentional, some accidental, some that reveal their true value only with time. "Welcome home, little one," I whispered. "You're going to grow up in a house built by love, maintained by hard work, and surrounded by a community that believes in taking care of each other. Your parents earned the right to raise you here, and they'll teach you to earn whatever blessings life offers you." As if she understood, baby Helen opened her eyes and looked directly at me with that unfocused, but somehow knowing gaze that all newborns possess. In that moment, I saw the future stretching ahead. Birthday parties in the garden, Christmas mornings by the fireplace, homework sessions at the kitchen table where 4 generations of families had struggled and celebrated and grown. The wooden box that had started this journey sat now in the nursery, repurposed as a keepsake chest where Sarah and Marcus had begun collecting mementos of their daughter's life. It seemed fitting that the humble container that had delivered such a profound lesson should become a repository for new memories, new stories, new evidence of lives lived with purpose and intention. Marcus joined me by the window, his arm around my shoulders as we looked out over the neighborhood that had become truly home to all of us. "Thank you," he said simply. "For the house, for the lesson, for believing we could become people who deserved what you gave us." "You earned every bit of it," I replied. "The house was just the beginning. Everything else, the community, the growth, the family you're building, that's all yours." As baby Helen slept peacefully in my arms, I thought about the difference between giving someone what they want and giving them what they need. Sometimes the greatest act of love is creating a challenge that forces people to discover their own strength, their own capacity for growth, their own ability to become more than they thought possible. The Henderson estate would shelter this new generation, but more importantly, it would continue to teach them that with every blessing comes responsibility, that true wealth is measured in relationships rather than possessions, and that the most valuable gifts are often the ones that arrive disguised as challenges. My wooden box had delivered its message perfectly, that sometimes the humblest packages contain the most life-changing gifts, and that the people who deserve extraordinary things are often the ones who learn to see the extraordinary in whatever they're given. 2 years after baby Helen's birth, I received a phone call that would change the trajectory of our family's story in ways I never could have anticipated. The caller was Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the director of the Morrison Foundation for Educational Excellence, a nonprofit organization I'd never heard of, but apparently one that had been operating for 3 years, using funds I didn't know I'd donated. "Mrs. Morrison," Dr. Martinez said in a voice that carried both professionalism and barely contained excitement, "I'm calling to inform you that your foundation has been selected to receive a matching grant from the Gates Foundation, but we need your approval for the expansion of our programs." I set down my coffee cup with careful precision, my mind racing to understand what I was hearing. "I'm sorry, Dr. Martinez, but I think there's been some mistake. I haven't established any foundation." There was a pause on the other end of the line, followed by the sound of papers rustling. "According to our records, the Morrison Foundation was established 3 years ago with an initial endowment of $5 million, with additional contributions of $2 million per year since inception. The Foundation's mission is to provide educational opportunities and literacy programs for underserved communities, with a particular focus on adult learners and non-traditional students." My hands began to tremble as understanding dawned. "Dr. Martinez, can you tell me who established this foundation? Who's been making these donations?" "The founding documents list Marcus and Sarah Thompson as the primary administrators, with Helen Morrison as the honorary chairwoman. Mrs. Morrison, if you didn't know about this foundation, I think you need to have a conversation with the Thompsons." Immediately. After hanging up with Dr. Martinez, I sat in my quiet apartment staring at the phone, trying to process what I'd just learned. $9 million. Marcus and Sarah had somehow donated $9 million to create an educational foundation in my name, and they'd never mentioned it to me. Not once in the past 3 years had they said anything about charitable giving, about foundations, about using their newfound financial stability to help others. But as the shock wore off, the pieces began falling into place. Marcus's promotion and subsequent rise within his firm hadn't just been about his improved character and leadership skills. The man who had once mocked my cheap gift had been quietly leveraging the Henderson estate's equity, the prestige of his address, and his growing network of wealthy neighbors into investment opportunities that had multiplied their wealth exponentially. More importantly, instead of using that wealth to upgrade their lifestyle or buy more impressive possessions, they had been systematically giving it away to create opportunities for others. The thought took my breath away. I drove to the Henderson estate immediately, my mind churning with questions and emotions I couldn't quite name. The house looked different somehow, or maybe I was seeing it with new eyes. The gardens that Marcus had learned to maintain himself were now showcases of seasonal beauty, the result of 3 years of patient learning and careful stewardship. The wraparound porch, where Sarah often worked on her graduate school assignments while baby Helen napped in her stroller, represented something far more valuable than architectural beauty. It represented a family that had learned to appreciate what they had while working to share their blessings with others. Sarah answered the door with Helen on her hip, both of them paint-splattered from what appeared to be an art project gone wonderfully wrong. At nearly 3 years old, Helen had inherited her grandfather's curious mind and her grandmother's determined spirit, along with her parents' growing understanding that mess and learning often went hand in hand. "Mom," Sarah exclaimed, clearly surprised but pleased to see me. "We weren't expecting you. Is everything okay?" "I think that's what I should be asking you," I replied, kissing Helen's paint-smeared cheek and following Sarah into the kitchen where evidence of their creative afternoon covered every available surface. Marcus emerged from his home office, sleeves rolled up and tie loosened, carrying a stack of papers that I now suspected contained information about investment portfolios and charitable giving strategies, rather than the routine financial documents I'd assumed he was always working on. "Helen," he said, his face lighting up with genuine warmth. "Perfect timing. I was just finishing up some quarterly reports that I think you'd find interesting." "Marcus," I said, settling Helen on my lap and looking directly at both of them. "I just received a call from Dr. Rebecca Martinez at the Morrison Foundation for Educational Excellence. She wanted to discuss a matching grant from the Gates Foundation, and she seemed to think I would know what she was talking about." The silence that followed was profound. Sarah and Marcus exchanged a look that contained volumes of communication, and I realized they'd been caught in something they'd never intended to keep secret forever. "We were going to tell you," Sarah said finally, her voice soft with something that might have been embarrassment or pride, or both. "We just wanted to make sure we could sustain the giving before we made it official." $9 million, I said quietly. "You've donated $9 million in 3 years, and you never mentioned it?" Marcus sat down across from me, his expression serious but not defensive. "Helen, when you gave us this house, you changed our lives in ways that went far beyond real estate. You taught us that wealth isn't about what you accumulate. It's about what you do with what you've been given. Every financial decision we've made since then has been guided by that principle." "But how?" I asked. "Your salaries, even with Marcus's promotions, couldn't possibly generate that kind of charitable giving." Sarah and Marcus looked at each other again, and I could see them making a decision in real time. "The house," Sarah said simply. "We discovered that owning the Henderson estate gave us access to investment opportunities we never would have had otherwise. Private equity deals, real estate partnerships, business investments that require substantial collateral or minimum investments." Marcus leaned forward, his financial advisor training evident in the precision of his explanation. "The house is worth significantly more now than what you paid for it, but more importantly, it serves as collateral for leveraged investments. We've been using conservative debt strategies to invest in opportunities that generate returns well beyond our carrying costs." "In English, please," I said, bouncing Helen on my lap as she played with my reading glasses. Sarah laughed, the sound bright and natural. "We've been using the house as a bank, essentially. We borrow against its value to invest in businesses and properties that generate income. The income pays off the loans and leaves us with substantial profits that we then donate to causes we believe in. It's a strategy that only works if you're disciplined about living below your means and reinvesting profits rather than spending them," Marcus added. "But since we learned to live on our original salaries during those first difficult months, we've been able to treat all the investment income as money that was never really ours to begin with." I stared at them, realizing that my gift of the Henderson estate had been transformed into something far more powerful than I'd ever imagined. They hadn't just learned to maintain an expensive house. They had learned to use wealth as a tool for creating more wealth, which they then systematically gave away to help others. The foundation focuses on adult literacy and non-traditional educational paths, Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger with enthusiasm. We've funded GED programs, computer literacy classes for seniors, English as a second language programs, and scholarship funds for people who want to go back to school later in life. Like me, I said, understanding flooding through me. You're funding programs for people like me, who became teachers later in life, who took unconventional paths to education. Exactly, Marcus said, and I could see the passion in his eyes that had once been reserved for talking about expensive cars and exclusive clubs. We've learned that some of the most effective teachers and leaders are people who bring life experience to their work, people who understand struggle and growth because they've lived it. Helen had grown restless in my lap, so I set her down and watched as she toddled back to her art supplies, her movements confident and purposeful in the way of children who grow up in homes where they're encouraged to explore and create. This little girl would grow up understanding that wealth carried responsibility, that success was measured by contribution rather than consumption. There's more, Sarah said, glancing at Marcus for confirmation. The Gates Foundation matching grant isn't just for our foundation. It's part of a larger initiative to replicate our model in other communities. They want to study how individual families can use real estate wealth to create sustained charitable giving programs. They're calling it the Henderson model, Marcus added with a slight smile. Named after our house, but really representing the idea that property ownership can be a platform for community investment, rather than just personal accumulation. I felt tears pricking my eyes as I realized the full scope of what my simple gift had unleashed. The wooden box that had contained a deed to one house had somehow sparked a movement that could transform how wealthy families approached philanthropy and community responsibility. How many people have been helped so far? I asked. Sarah pulled out a tablet and began scrolling through what appeared to be detailed program reports. Direct beneficiaries number just over 2,000 people, but if you count family members, who benefit when someone completes their GED or learns computer skills that help them get better jobs, we're probably looking at impacts on 5,000 to 7,000 lives. And that's just our foundation, Marcus added. 3 other families in our neighborhood have started similar programs after seeing what we were doing. Mrs. Patterson established a fund for home repair assistance for elderly homeowners. The Chens created a scholarship program for first-generation college students. The Williamses are funding a community health clinic. I realized that the Heritage Festival and community-building activities that had seemed like simple neighborly cooperation were actually the foundation for a sophisticated network of mutual support and shared philanthropy. The Henderson estate hadn't just transformed Marcus and Sarah. It had become the catalyst for transforming an entire community's approach to wealth and responsibility. There's something else we need to discuss, Marcus said, his tone becoming more serious. The matching grant from Gates comes with a requirement that the foundation have active oversight from its honorary chairwoman. Dr. Martinez wasn't just calling to inform you about the grant. She was calling to ask if you'd be willing to take a more active role in guiding the foundation's direction. They want me to help run a $9 million foundation? I asked, the magnitude of the request hitting me like a physical force. They want you to help run what could become a $50 million foundation if we accept the matching grant and expansion opportunity, Sarah corrected gently. Helen, you've spent your entire career understanding how education can transform lives. You know which programs work and which ones don't. You understand the communities we're trying to serve because you've been part of those communities. I looked around the kitchen where we were sitting, taking in the evidence of a life lived with intention and purpose. Sarah's graduate school, textbooks stacked beside children's picture books, Marcus's financial journals next to Helen's coloring books, family photos mixed with community newsletter clippings and volunteer schedules. This wasn't the sterile showcase of wealth that I'd feared the Henderson estate might become. It was the vibrant, messy, generous heart of a family that had learned to balance personal happiness with social responsibility. "What would my role involve?" I asked. "Whatever you want it to involve," Marcus replied. "We've been learning as we go, but we know we need guidance from someone with deeper educational experience. You could help us evaluate program proposals, visit sites to assess effectiveness, maybe even help design new initiatives based on your understanding of what works in education." "The foundation could fund teacher training programs," Sarah added, her excitement building. "Professional development for educators who want to work with adult learners, research into best practices for non-traditional students, maybe even scholarship programs for people who want to become teachers later in life." I thought about Mrs. Chen and the literacy program she'd started, about the satisfaction I'd found in volunteering with adult learners, about the countless former students who had told me that my classes had changed their lives, not just academically, but personally. This foundation could be a way to amplify that impact, to help hundreds of other educators reach thousands of other students. "I'll need to think about it," I said. But even as I spoke the words, I knew what my answer would be. "Of course," Sarah said. "Take all the time you need, but Mom, I hope you'll seriously consider it. This foundation exists because of the lesson you taught us about using what you've been given to help others. It seems only right that you should help guide where it goes next." That evening, I sat in my apartment with a stack of foundation reports that Marcus and Sarah had given me, reading detailed accounts of lives changed through educational opportunities. Maria Gonzalez, a 53-year-old housekeeper who earned her GED and was now studying to become a certified nursing assistant. James Wilson, a former factory worker who learned computer programming through a foundation-funded boot camp and was now teaching others. Dorothy Kim, a grandmother who completed an English literacy program and was now helping other immigrants navigate citizenship applications. Each story was a reminder that education wasn't just about individual advancement. It was about breaking cycles of limitation and creating ripple effects that touched entire families and communities. The foundation wasn't just giving people skills, it was giving them the confidence to dream bigger and the tools to achieve those dreams. I called Sarah the next morning. "I accept," I said simply when she answered the phone. "Mom, that's wonderful. But are you sure? It's a big commitment." "I'm sure," I replied. "Your father always believed that the best way to honor a gift was to use it to create more gifts for others. This foundation is exactly what David would have wanted his legacy to become." "There's one more thing," Sarah said, her voice soft, with emotion. "We'd like to rename it. Not the Morrison Foundation, but the Morrison-Thompson Foundation for Educational Excellence. We want Helen Patricia to grow up understanding that her family's wealth comes with the responsibility to help others, and we want your name connected to ours in this work." 6 months later, I stood on the same stage in the Henderson Estates garden where Marcus had given his speech about community stewardship. But this time, I was addressing a gathering of foundation donors, program participants, and educational leaders from across the state. The Morrison-Thompson Foundation had officially accepted the Gates Foundation matching grant, and we were announcing the expansion of our programs to 5 additional communities. "Education is the great equalizer," I said, looking out at faces that represented every age, ethnicity, and background imaginable. "But only when it's accessible to everyone who seeks it, regardless of their starting point or their timeline for learning." In the front row, Sarah sat with 3-year-old Helen on her lap, and beside them Marcus held their newest addition, David Marcus Thompson, born just 2 months earlier. Behind them, Mrs. Chen beamed with pride as she held a certificate recognizing her literacy program's integration into our foundation's network. Mrs. Patterson sat with the neighborhood association members who had become partners in our community. Investment initiatives. The Morrison-Thompson Foundation exists because one family learned that the greatest privilege isn't owning something beautiful, I continued, but having the opportunity to share that beauty with others. We've learned that wealth isn't about what you accumulate, but about what you create. And we've discovered that the most valuable gifts are often the ones that challenge us to become better than we thought possible. As I spoke, I caught sight of the wooden box sitting on a display table near the garden's edge, now labeled as the Foundation's founding artifact. It had become a symbol of the truth that motivated all our work, that humble beginnings could contain extraordinary possibilities, that simple gestures could spark transformational change, and that the most important measure of success was not what you achieved for yourself, but what you made possible for others. The story that had begun with mockery and misunderstanding had become something far more beautiful, a legacy of purposeful generosity that would continue long after all of us were gone, touching lives we would never meet, creating opportunities we could never fully measure, building a better world one educated mind at a time. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, little Helen tugged on my dress and looked up at me with serious 3-year-old eyes. "Grandma Helen," she said in her clear, confident voice, "Mommy says you gave us our house. Is that true?" I knelt down to her level, thinking about how to explain the complexity of gifts and responsibilities and growth to someone so young. "I gave your parents an opportunity," I said finally. "They turned it into a home, and then they turned that home into a way to help lots of other people. The house was just the beginning of the story." She nodded solemnly, as if this made perfect sense to her. "When I grow up, I want to help people too." "You will," I said, pulling her into a hug. "You already are, just by being part of a family that believes helping others is the most important thing we can do." As I looked around at the garden filled with people whose lives had been touched by the Foundation's work, I realized that my simple wooden box had delivered the most valuable gift of all. The understanding that true wealth multiplies when it's shared, that real success is measured by the lives we touch, and that the most profound changes often begin with the smallest acts of faith in other people's potential to grow. The Henderson estate stood behind us, beautiful and stately in the evening light, but it was no longer just a house. It had become the foundation for something far more valuable, a legacy of purposeful giving that would continue to grow and spread long after the last mortgage payment was made, the last repair completed, the last story told. My wooden box had taught its lesson well, and now it was time for the next generation to discover what gifts they could create from the opportunities they'd been given. 5 years had passed since the Foundation's expansion, and I was sitting in my new office at the Morrison Thompson Educational Center, a converted Victorian mansion 3 blocks from the Henderson estate that had become our headquarters for what was now a $28 million operation spanning 12 states. The irony wasn't lost on me that I, who had spent my career in modest school buildings with outdated textbooks and squeaky chairs, was now overseeing educational programs from a restored 19th century mansion with crystal chandeliers and hardwood floors that gleamed like mirrors. But the real transformation wasn't in the elegant surroundings. It was in the letter I held in my hands, written in careful cursive by someone whose life had been changed by our work in ways that went far beyond educational achievement. "Dear Mrs. Morrison," the letter began, "my name is Elena Vasquez, and I am writing to thank you for giving me back my voice. 3 years ago, I was a 45-year-old woman who cleaned office buildings at night and had never learned to read properly. I was too ashamed to help my children with homework, too afraid to apply for better jobs, too embarrassed to participate in parent-teacher conferences. The Morrison Thompson Foundation's literacy program didn't just teach me to read. It taught me that it's never too late to become the person you were meant to be." Elena's letter went on to describe how she had not only completed her GED but had gone on to earn an associate degree in early childhood education. She was now working as a teaching assistant in a Head Start program and had been accepted into a bachelor's degree program with the goal of becoming a certified teacher. But what moved me most was her closing paragraph. "I am writing this letter, not just to thank you. but to tell you that I have started my own small scholarship fund for other immigrant women who want to return to school. I can only give $50 a month, but I learned from your example that it's not the size of the gift that matters. It's the belief behind it. You believed in me before I believed in myself, and now I want to pass that gift forward to others. I set the letter down and looked out my office window at the garden where Sarah was teaching an outdoor class to a group of foundation scholarship recipients. At 8 years old, Helen was helping her mother by handing out worksheets. To the adult students, her natural confidence and kindness already evident in the way she interacted with people 3 times her age. 5-year-old David was building elaborate structures with blocks in the corner, his grandfather's inventive mind already showing itself in the creative solutions he found to engineering challenges. These children were growing up understanding that education was a family value, that helping others was as natural as breathing, and that privilege carried responsibility. They were living proof that values could be transmitted not through lectures, but through example, not through words, but through witness. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Turn on Channel 7 News. They're running a feature on the Foundation's impact on statewide literacy rates. I reached for the remote and switched on the small television in my office. The news anchor, a woman I recognized as one of our early scholarship recipients who had gone on to earn a journalism degree, was standing in front of a community college campus. 5 years ago, adult literacy rates in underserved communities across our state were declining, she reported. Today, thanks to innovative programs funded by the Morrison-Thompson Foundation, those same communities are showing dramatic improvements in educational attainment, job placement rates, and economic mobility. The Foundation's approach, which combines traditional classroom instruction with mentorship programs and community support networks, has become a national model for adult education. The camera cut to an interview with Dr. Martinez, our foundation director, who was explaining how our programs differed from traditional adult education models. We've learned that successful adult education isn't just about providing classes, she said. It's about creating comprehensive support systems that address the real barriers adults face when returning to school: childcare, transportation, work schedules, and often, the psychological barriers that come from years of believing they're not capable of academic success. The report featured several program participants, including a man named Robert Chen, no relation to our neighbor Mrs. Chen, who had left high school at 16 to support his family and was now, at 52, completing his bachelor's degree in engineering with the goal of starting his own renewable energy consulting firm. His story was particularly meaningful to me because it demonstrated how education could be both personally transformative and socially beneficial. I used to think education was something you either got when you were young or missed forever, Robert said in his interview. The Morrison-Thompson Foundation showed me that learning is a lifelong opportunity, and that my life experience actually makes me a better student now than I would have been at 18. The news segment concluded with statistics that made my heart swell with pride. Over the past 5 years, our programs had directly served more than 8,000 adult learners, with a completion rate of 87% and job placement. Rates averaging 93% within 6 months of program completion. But the numbers that truly mattered to me were the ones they didn't mention. The children who were now being helped with homework by parents who could read. The families who had moved out of poverty because someone had gained new skills. The communities that were stronger because their members had been empowered to contribute more fully. As I was processing the impact of seeing our work featured on the news, Sarah knocked on my office door and entered with a stack of files and an expression that I'd learned to recognize as her big idea face. "Mom," she said, settling into the chair across from my desk, "I have something I want to discuss with you, and I think you're going to find it both exciting and terrifying." I leaned back in my chair, smiling at my daughter's directness. Over the past 8 years, Sarah had evolved from the uncertain young woman who had been intimidated by the Henderson estate's grandeur into a confident leader who could present complex educational initiatives to foundation boards and government officials with equal skill. I've been contacted by the Department of Education, she continued, opening the top file and spreading several documents across my desk. They want to pilot a national version of our community-based education model. The pilot would involve 50 communities across 25 states, with federal funding of $120 million over 3 years. I stared at the documents, trying to process the magnitude of what Sarah was describing. A national pilot program? The idea would be to establish Morrison-Thompson learning centers in communities that meet specific demographic criteria, places with high rates of adult educational need, but limited resources to address those needs. Each center would be modeled on our approach here, with local community leaders working alongside professional educators to create culturally responsive programming. The scope was breathtaking, but it was also daunting. Sarah, that's an enormous undertaking, the logistics alone. Which is why they want us to partner with 3 major universities and 2 established nonprofits, she interrupted, her excitement building as she outlined the proposal. We wouldn't be doing this alone. We'd be the lead organization, providing the educational philosophy and community engagement model, while our partners would handle different aspects of implementation and evaluation. I picked up one of the documents and began reading the detailed proposal. The federal government wasn't just offering to fund an expansion of our work. They were asking us to help reimagine how adult education could be delivered at a national scale. It was an opportunity to impact hundreds of thousands of lives, but it was also a responsibility that felt almost overwhelming. What would this mean for our current programs? I asked. That's the beautiful part, Sarah replied, leaning forward with enthusiasm. Our existing programs would continue unchanged, but they would become training sites for the national initiative. Educators from around the country would come here to learn our methods, to understand how community engagement and academic instruction can be integrated, to see how family involvement and peer support can accelerate learning outcomes. I thought about Elena Vasquez and her $50 a month scholarship fund, about Robert Chen and his dreams of renewable energy consulting, about the thousands of other adults whose lives had been changed because Marcus and Sarah had learned to use their wealth responsibly. The ripple effects of that single wooden box continued to expand in ways I never could have imagined. There's something else, Sarah said, her voice taking on a more serious tone. The proposal includes provisions for the Morrison-Thompson model, to be taught in education schools across the country. They want to change how we train teachers to work with adult learners, to make community-based education a standard part of teacher preparation programs. This possibility excited me more than any of the other aspects of the proposal. I'd spent my career working with young teachers who had excellent intentions, but little understanding of how to connect with students whose educational experiences had been interrupted or negative. If we could help future educators understand that teaching adults required different skills, different approaches, and different assumptions, we could multiply our impact exponentially. What's the timeline? I asked. If we accept, the planning phase would begin immediately, with the first pilot sites launching in 18 months. The federal funding would be supplemented by matching funds from local communities and corporate sponsors, and there would be opportunities for additional foundation partnerships. I looked out my window again, watching as Helen helped one of the adult learners sound out a difficult word. There was something profound about seeing a child teach an adult, about witnessing the natural human impulse to share knowledge regardless of age or formal authority. That scene encapsulated everything I believed about education. That learning was a collaborative process, that wisdom could flow in any direction, and that the most important lessons often happened outside traditional classroom settings. What does Marcus think about this? I asked. Sarah smiled, and I could see the partnership that had developed between her and her husband over the years of working together on the foundation. He's already run preliminary financial projections and risk assessments. He thinks we can manage the expansion without compromising our existing programs. And he's identified several investment strategies that could help us build an endowment large enough to sustain operations beyond the federal funding period. I shouldn't have been surprised. The man who had once worried only about his own image and advancement had become someone who thought in terms of long-term sustainability and community impact. Marcus's transformation had been as profound as any of our program participants, proving that growth was possible at any stage of life when people were given the right challenges and support. "There's one more thing," Sarah said, reaching for the final document in her stack. "The Department of Education wants to name the national initiative the Morrison Method, in recognition of your contributions to adult education theory and practice." I felt tears prick my eyes as I realized what this meant. My name would be associated with an educational approach that could reach millions of adult learners across the country. The quiet teacher who had spent decades working in modest schools, with limited resources, was being asked to help reshape how America approached adult education. "I need time to think about this," I said, though I knew in my heart what my answer would be. "Of course," Sarah replied, beginning to gather her documents. "But Mom, I hope you'll say yes. This is our chance to prove that the wooden box philosophy, that small gestures can create enormous change, can work on a national scale." That evening, I walked through the Henderson Estates gardens with Helen and David, listening as they chattered about their day at school and their excitement about the Foundation's work. Helen had started a reading program for younger children at her elementary school, while David had designed a series of building challenges that were being used in the after-school program for kids whose parents were enrolled in our adult education classes. These children understood intuitively what it had taken me decades to learn: that education was not a commodity to be consumed, but a gift to be shared. That success was measured not by what you achieved for yourself, but by what you made possible for others, and that the most valuable possessions were often the ones you gave away. As we reached the garden's edge, Helen tugged on my hand and pointed to the wooden box, now permanently displayed on a pedestal with a plaque explaining its significance to the Foundation's history. "Grandma Helen," she said, her 8-year-old, voice serious and thoughtful. "Do you think that box knew it was going to change so many lives?" I knelt down to her level, thinking about how to explain the mysterious ways that small actions can have enormous consequences. "I think," I said carefully, "that box was just doing what it was made to do. Hold something valuable and keep it safe until the right moment to share it. Sometimes the most important thing we can do is simply be ready for the opportunities life gives us to make a difference." Helen nodded solemnly, as if this made perfect sense to her. "When I grow up, I want to give people opportunities too." "You already are," I told her, pulling both children into a hug. "Every time you help someone learn something new, every time you show kindness to someone who needs it, every time you use what you've been given to help others, you're giving them opportunities." As we walked back toward the house, I made my decision about the federal proposal. The wooden box had started with one family's transformation, had grown to impact one community, had expanded to influence one state, and was now being called to shape educational policy for an entire nation. The lesson was clear. When we use our gifts responsibly, when we treat privilege as responsibility, when we measure success by contribution rather than accumulation, there are no limits to the positive change we can create. The Morrison Method wasn't really about adult education techniques or community engagement strategies. It was about the fundamental belief that everyone deserves the opportunity to grow, to learn, to become more than they thought possible, regardless of their age, background, or starting point. Tomorrow, I would call Sarah and tell her yes. Yes to the National Pilot Program, yes to the Morrison Method, yes to the chance to prove that the principles contained in one humble wooden box could transform education policy for millions of American adults. The ripple effects would continue to spread, but this time they would reach farther than I had ever dared to imagine. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them. Out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.